California is often presented as the most advanced hydrogen refueling market in the United States. It hosts the vast majority of public retail hydrogen stations in the country, has received some of the largest cumulative public support for light-duty hydrogen fueling, and has the longest-running retail station network in operation. On paper, this appears to demonstrate that hydrogen infrastructure can be deployed at scale. But when the network is examined under real operating conditions, a different lesson emerges. What survives under grid pressure does not necessarily perform economically. In California's case, the hydrogen station network has largely remained in place, but at the cost of utilization stability, operational predictability, and ultimately dollars per kilogram. The critical distinction is survival versus performance. California's hydrogen stations did not disappear as a system. Instead, many have experienced recurring periods of reduced availability driven by supply disruptions, maintenance requirements, and operational downtime. Stations have often operated intermittently, delivering hydrogen at low or inconsistent throughput. Fixed capital and operating costs remain largely unchanged in these conditions, while kilograms dispensed fluctuate or fall. The result is economic fragility, even when stations are technically operational. This outcome is not primarily a failure of hydrogen technology. It is the result of system-level stress shaped by grid access, power pricing structures, reliability constraints, and operational limitations that compound over time. Grid stress in California is not hypothetical. The state operates a highly constrained and operationally complex electricity system shaped by congestion, reliability requirements, and wildfire risk. High renewable penetration introduces variability in supply and pricing. Transmission limitations restrict where and when power can flow. Wildfire mitigation practices can increase the risk of localized outages or de-energization events. Interconnection upgrades and service expansions often require multi-year timelines. In this environment, hydrogen stations do not simply connect to the grid and operate continuously. Their performance is shaped by power availability, pricing windows, and reliability constraints that can limit consistent operation. Hydrogen refueling stations are capital-intensive assets. Compressors, chillers, storage vessels, dispensers, and safety systems impose fixed costs regardless of how much hydrogen is dispensed. Most station business models assume utilization growth over time. As more vehicles are served, kilograms dispensed per day increase, spreading fixed costs across higher output and reducing cost per kilogram. Grid constraints disrupt this trajectory. When stations face limited operating windows, high power costs during peak periods, or intermittent outages, utilization growth stalls. Fixed costs remain, variable costs can rise, and the cost per kilogram moves upward rather than down. Many California hydrogen stations rely on delivered hydrogen rather than on-site electrolysis. This does not remove exposure to grid conditions. Hydrogen liquefaction, compression, and transportation depend on electricity upstream. When grid constraints or power-related disruptions affect these upstream processes, hydrogen availability at stations becomes unpredictable. Stations may remain physically intact while facing supply shortages. Drivers encounter outages or limited service, demand becomes irregular, and utilization declines further. These dynamics are not visible in nameplate capacity figures, but they dominate real-world economics. Stations that include on-site electrolysis face a different set of grid-driven constraints. Electrolyzers are often described as flexible loads, but in practice their operation is shaped by interconnection limits, time-of-use pricing, demand charges, and reliability requirements. Operating primarily during low-price windows can leave expensive equipment underutilized. Operating during high-price periods can severely degrade cost per kilogram. Many facilities settle into partial operation, sufficient to remain active but insufficient to achieve economic efficiency. This intermediate state allows projects to survive, technically while remaining financially constrained. California's hydrogen station network reveals a broader truth about infrastructure under stress. Systems adapt to remain compliant and operational, not necessarily optimal. Stations adjust by limiting operating hours, relying more heavily on trucked hydrogen, or reducing output during constrained periods. These adaptations keep permits valid and assets in service, but they also lock in low utilization. Over time, the system stabilizes in a suboptimal equilibrium. Hydrogen remains available but expensive. Infrastructure exists but remains fragile. Expansion slows because underlying economics do not improve. This is why survival under grid stress can be misleading. Observers see stations operating and assume progress. Policymakers count assets and interpret persistence as success. Developers and financiers see different signals. They see volatile operating profiles, exposure to electricity price spikes, irregular supply, and utilization curves that fail to inflect upward. They see cost per kilogram that does not converge toward sustainable thresholds. These signals, not installed capacity, determine whether projects are replicated or quietly paused. California's experience matters because it is frequently treated as a reference model. Other regions assume that if hydrogen stations can persist there, they can succeed anywhere. A more accurate lesson is that California illustrates what happens when hydrogen infrastructure is introduced into a power system that is already under stress. Reliability obligations and existing grid constraints shape outcomes. New loads adapt downward. Economics weaken before outright failure occurs. This pattern is not unique to California. It is a preview of challenges that emerge wherever grid constraints intersect with hydrogen deployment. The key variable is not hydrogen demand alone. It is not vehicle adoption by itself. It is not electrolyzer efficiency in isolation. It is utilization under constraint. Hydrogen economics are unforgiving at low throughput. Below certain utilization levels, fixed costs dominate, and financial performance deteriorates regardless of optimization efforts. If grid conditions cap utilization, a project can remain operational while being effectively precluded from economic success. This is where many hydrogen models break. They assume ramp-up curves that discount grid friction. They treat access to electricity as equivalent to reliable availability. They assume curtailment and constraints are temporary. California's experience shows that these assumptions often do not hold in stressed systems. Grid conditions evolve slowly. Interconnection queues lengthen. Transmission expansion lags. Projects that survive adapt structurally to constraint rather than waiting for relief. At this stage in the video, Renee Energy typically directs viewers to H2 Hub, not as a sales pitch, but as a reference environment where hydrogen projects are evaluated through grid access, utilization ceilings, financing durability, and execution reality rather than installed capacity alone. For developers, consultants, and investors, this level of system analysis determines outcomes. California's hydrogen station network did not collapse. It persisted in a constrained operating state. That is the more subtle and consequential failure mode. Capital remains deployed, progress appears visible, but structural limitations delay meaningful improvement. For developers, the lesson is clear. Grid conditions must be treated as first-order design variables. Utilization must be stress-tested under realistic power and supply constraints. And cost per kilogram must be evaluated at constrained operating levels, not at theoretical peak output. What California demonstrates is not that hydrogen cannot work. It demonstrates that hydrogen cannot outrun the grid. When grid stress defines the ceiling, survival is not success. Utilization determines economics, and economics determine whether hydrogen scales or stabilizes at the margins.